Well, a great warm welcome here to Revelation TV. We are looking at Revelation TV Presents with myself, Anne Dawson. And this is all about journey through the feasts. And hopefully you have been with us for part of that journey. Someone who's helping us along the road here is Tom Brooker. Tom, it's great to have you on board. And it's all about the whole faith of Yeshua, the faith of Jesus. This is what we're trying to look at how it relates to us as Christians and to the extent we should be getting involved. Because if we were to put up a little hashtag, like I've said beforehand, it's not just about having faith in Jesus, but it's important not to lose the faith of Jesus. If we could just say a few words on that, Tom, before we get started on our next step of the journey.
Absolutely. I think what we have to understand is the New Testament, written by Jewish authors within a Jewish context, Yeshua himself being Jewish, in order to properly understand his words and in order to properly worship and follow, our Messiah, we need to understand how he would have understood things, how his disciples would have understood things. And so understanding the Jewish context, understanding Jewish culture, Jewish practices in the first century are absolutely key.
It's about taking a lot of the filters off that we've accumulated, not just over the centuries, but even longer since the days of the early church. Well, our journey continues, and really what's quite interesting is how things have dramatically changed since you last saw us, and that was when we were discussing the Feast of Tabernacles, which was just before the recent events of October the 7th. And the irony of our next destination in terms of a feast is we're coming on to Hanukkah now, and really when we look at the rise of anti-Semitism and just the blatant outward display of anti-Semitism that we've seen on October the 7th and since then, really kind of, makes us think back. This is not new. This has its roots from way, way, way back. And if we look at the Feast of Hanukkah, although this is a celebration, it's a celebration over the defeat of anti-Semitism. Now, you've said, Tom, as we've discussed, that there's basically two types of anti-Semitism that we see. Let's just talk about that for a moment, if we can, and then we can talk more about Hanukkah and what happened then. Okay.
So I would identify two different types of anti-Semitism, like you said. The first one, typically we see classically with Hanukkah, which is anti-Semitism through efforts to assimilate the Jewish people, assimilate Israel, sort of remove any distinction of the Jewish nation and cause them basically to look and worship and practice exactly like all the other nations. The second is anti-Semitism through annihilation. So when we come on to looking at Purim, that's a good example. But we see things more clearly as we look at Hitler and the Nazi regime, how their efforts were not to assimilate the Jewish people, but to wipe them out, annihilate them completely. And over the course of history, we've really seen efforts in both areas by, in some cases, the church even, which is an uncomfortable truth, to either assimilate or destroy the Jewish people.
And if we look at events that are happening as we speak, I think in previous conversations, Tom, you've said that, yes, shocked but not surprised.
It's an age-old issue. It's not new. We've seen ever since the whole issue of Ishmael and Isaac, there has been enmity between the Jewish people and, in this case, the Arab world, but we can't exclusively give hatred of the Jews into the camp of the Arabs or the Muslims or Hamas even. We've seen hatred of the Jewish people throughout Europe, throughout the centuries. Christians, Muslims, all have hated for different reasons.
I think the common denominator there is it's satanic at its core.
Absolutely. At its root.
That's what we're looking at.
Yeah. And the reality is that anti-Semitism unites Christians, Muslims, the far left, the far right. People who are otherwise ideologically opposed are united in their hatred of the Jews, which means that it's not ideology that's the issue. It's something much more spiritual, much more fundamental, as you say.
And as you say, you know, we've seen it right throughout. Now, when we actually come on to Hanukkah, and we can, maybe you'll give us a bit more of an in-depth detail as to what was going on at the time and in terms of that attempted assimilation, and to a larger extent successful assimilation, as a lot of the Jews had buckled and given into that. But it's the events that led up to a liberation, and which has cause for a wonderful celebration, although it does beg the question how that's going to be this year, because it really doesn't feel that they have got a lot to celebrate. But it's worth remembering where God has come through and where they've had past victories, and God will have the last word, that we know.
Well, we can rest assured with that, can't we? We know how this story ends, even though in the midst of it, the events we're seeing are horrific. The events of Hanukkah, they start around about 4th century BC, where we have the Greek conquest of the, sort of the known world. And we have Alexander the Great, and he rises up, and after Alexander dies, basically an evil Greek king rises up, a guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And everybody under his rule, he wants to encourage them, I use that word cautiously, but he wants them to basically take on Greek Hellenistic culture with all of the worship practices and everything else. And so he imposes that across the area of his reign. And within that area is also Judea and Samaria, obviously the Jews living there. And so he wants to impose Greek culture and lifestyle on the Jews.
Now, on the surface of that, you know, if we didn't know any better, we'd think, well, okay, that's you know, everybody coming together, big, you know, group hug. That's not too bad. keeps the peace. But it's not like that. There's a lot more to. There's a darker side to what he was trying to do here.
Absolutely. I mean, the concept of unity always sounds like a very positive thing, doesn't it?
Yes.
Get everybody together, and like you said, big group hug, we'll all celebrate the same holy days and all the rest of it, worship the same gods. But the point was that he wanted everybody to worship not only the same gods, but he identified himself as Antiochus Epiphanes, God manifest as man. So he identified as God and wanted also to be worshipped. Most of the peoples in the areas that he reigned over were quite happy to basically take up Greek culture, worship the pantheon of Greek gods and so on. It wasn't a problem until it came to the Jews. And of course, the Jewish people throughout history with a monotheistic perspective, worshipping the one God, that's a problem in the area of polytheism. And so he went through a series of, you could say, boycott, divestment and sanction schemes, threats to boot.
We could be in 2023
I know. It doesn't change, does it? But he went through a series of efforts, basically, to encourage the Jews to either assimilate or pay the penalty, death, which is what he did.
And some of the ways in which he forced the Jews to take on his suggestions were quite horrific, actually. If you have just joined us, we are, of course, journeying through the feast with myself, Anne Dawson, and Tom Brooker. We are concentrating today on Hanukkah. It's an 8-day festival, an 8-day feast, really reiterating the triumph of the Jews over the attempts at anti-Semitism. And like I said a moment ago, some things don't change. Here we are, 2023, and we're seeing, horrific acts in actual fact. What were some of the things that he either didn't want to see happening or he imposed that would have been a shock to the Jewish nation, those that wanted to follow after the one true God?
Well, Antiochus' goal was basically to get the Jewish people to forget the law, forget their God by any means necessary. That was the goal. And you can find all of these things described in the books of the Maccabees, which are historical Jewish books, which explain it all. He forbid sacrificing in the temple, he forbid burnt offerings, he banned the Sabbath and all the holy days, anything which distinguished worship of the God of Israel from worship of any of the other gods. That was basically the thing that he banned. he insisted that the priests would desecrate themselves. Again, it almost didn't matter how, so long as they did, whether it was force-feeding them bacon sandwiches, for example, or any other means. Forbid circumcision. In fact, we have some horrific accounts in the Maccabees of how if a child was found to have been circumcised, he was killed, hung around his mother's neck, and they were paraded through the streets of Jerusalem. So, I mean, really barbaric things. But the goal was simple. It almost didn't matter what the Jewish people did, so long as it was in contravention of the Torah, and anything to basically turn their backs on God, apostatize.
Absolutely shocking, and really resonates probably more than we ever imagined it would, Tom, when we got to this point in our journey through the feasts. So we've got to the stage where Antiochus Epiphanes, with him believing himself to be God and wanting to be worshipped as God, how did that actually culminate, and how did the Jews resist and revolt?
Well, many Jews actually chose to assimilate. Many Jews chose their own personal lives over worshipping God. So many, willingly turned their backs on God and on everything Jewish, the Torah and everything else to do. But a lot of the Jewish community at that point in time were very zealous for God. And so they took the option to stand and fight. They were a ragtag bunch at that point in time. There was no sort of clear organization. But what happened is a guy called Judah the Maccabee, who was from a priestly family, basically rose up as a freedom fighter, leading others that would gather to him. And he led a sort of a guerrilla warfare against the much better equipped, Greek army, and eventually won a victory. And I mean, the fact that this sort of little ragtag bunch of Jews were able to win that victory over the Greek army at that point in time, that is a miracle of itself. I mean, the numbers were stacked against them. But along the way, interesting, we mentioned at the beginning about understanding the context of Jesus, of Yeshua. A lot of the time in the Gospels, we see these discussions about, what is lawful on the Sabbath. And what many won't necessarily realize is that some of the discussions around that actually originated at this point in history. Of course, God-fearing Jews were resting on the Sabbath. And so the Greeks, knowing this, came and attacked them and actually managed to wipe out pockets of Jews. And this provoked a discussion which said basically, if we continue to rest on the Sabbath, the entire Jewish community is going to be wiped out. We're all going to be killed. So they discussed amongst themselves and recognized that actually life needed to take priority over resting, the Sabbath prohibition to rest.
So that's where we get the whole discussion about there are exceptions.
There are. It became a natural part of the Jewish understanding of how to interpret the law. It's something that a lot of the time Christians don't sort of fully appreciate, the interpretive
I had no idea that's
methods.
where that went back to. And yet, just, as a matter of context, in time, what period are we actually looking at here? What was the time difference between Yeshua and what happened previously?
So the events of Hanukkah take place 165, 164 BC. That's when the actual events of Hanukkah took place. The Greek conquest, we're talking 4th century, so 300, 333, something like that, is Alexander the Great taking power. So,
and when we think about Alexander the Great, and then, he had a dramatic reign, but not a very long one. And, how everything changed after that. They were still mighty armies to be reckoned with. And when you compare that to the small, shall we say, Israeli army of the Maccabees trying to revolt or stand their ground or maintain their identity, it's almost reminiscent of 1948. The minute that Israel is becoming a nation, they are surrounded, they are attacked. Totally unprepared for this. They didn't have a big, strong national army. They were not the Israel in terms of an army as we see with the IDF today.
No, absolutely. And it's a recurring theme, isn't it? if God is for me, who can be against me?
Amen.
And whether it be today with what we see going on at the moment, whether it be in the last sort of 70 or so years of Israel being a nation, or historically, God is there supporting, providing victory for the Jewish
And he
people.
is sovereign, and yeah, absolutely. What we can highlight at this stage is the fact that we started with the previous feasts, and we're saying, Leviticus 23 and all part of the Moedim. People will say, well, Hanukkah's not part of that. But we have strong biblical evidence that Jesus, Yeshua, celebrated this. And if it's good enough for him, it should be good enough for us as well, shouldn't it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, people are right. It's not part of the biblically appointed times that God said, these are the feasts, the festivals of Israel. But we do have biblical evidence for it. And a lot of people will maybe be familiar with John 10, verse 22, where we have an account of Yeshua himself in the temple in Jerusalem at the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Hanukkah, which is what we're talking about. Yeshua didn't live in Jerusalem, so the strong implication is that he's gone up to Jerusalem to celebrate this particular festival.
Very much worth celebrating. And if I can backtrack, sorry, I'm kind of like jumping all over the spot here, but it's fascinating. In terms of their victory, if we can continue that story.
The victory of the Maccabees, absolutely. So just to add into that, actually, we do get another biblical reference to this, and that's in Daniel 8, where Daniel has this vision, and he has the vision of the ram and the goat and everything that follows. And actually what we read, or what we understood took place with the Maccabean victory over Antiochus, is prophesied by Daniel in Daniel 8. So whilst the events of Hanukkah are recorded in the books of the Maccabees, they are prophesied in the scriptures in Daniel 8. So it's something we should pay attention to in that sense as well. But basically what took place was that the Greeks under Antiochus' lead desecrated the temple. They tried to force all of the Jewish people to apostatize. They
sacrificed a pig on the altar.
They sacrificed pigs and any other unclean animal they could think of on the altar. And on the winter solstice of 165, on the birthday of Zeus, they erected a statue to Zeus in his honor in the temple. Of course, this was, about as bad as it's going to get. 1 year later, after numerous guerrilla skirmishes and so on, the Maccabees managed to take charge once again of the Temple Mount, and all the areas. They took out Zeus's statue, they cleansed the temple, and one of the things that was needed in order to cleanse the temple was that the temple menorah, the lampstand, was lit in order that all the cleansing rituals could take place. The eternal light, it was never to go out. And one of the miracles that's also associated with Hanukkah is the fact that when they took over the temple again, they found the oil. They only had enough oil to last for maybe a day. So they lit the menorah, and part of the miraculous account is that it actually burned for 8 full days, which enabled them to make more oil during that time. So it's one of the associations that we have with this festival is the menorah, the light, the oil is all part of the miracle story that occurred.
And interesting that it's 8 days that it burned and not 7 days. The 8 days, I just find it, I'm not trying to make a big thing of this, but it just occurred to me, this was only last night, it occurred to me that, Jews are circumcised on the 8th day. That's also known as their name day. The circumcision is national identity. It's their corporate identity as Jews. And of course, you've got corporate identity and personal identity if you're thinking about circumcising a child, that's also the name day. So it just seems, it's like, here we are again, God is sovereign, God has moved in, God has given them the victory. They have their corporate identity as well as their individual personal identity. And it is all about that at the end of the day. It's this push that we've seen for, centuries in order to quash the identity of the Jews. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment, we were talking earlier, it's not about the land. It's not about the land. We might think it's about the land, but it's never been, because you were having a conversation, you were telling me the other day with someone, and you don't know where. It's really difficult these days. You don't know where people are going to stand, especially when you've got something that's so much in the news at the moment, and there's so much propaganda, and people are asking, what's your stance on this? Where do you stand? You asked some interesting questions, didn't you?
Well, it wasn't about the land in 1290 when they were expelled from England. It wasn't about the land in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue because they were being expelled from Spain. It wasn't about the land during the late 1930s and 1940s when they were being exterminated in camps in Europe. They didn't have possession of the land at that point in time, so it certainly wasn't about the land then. And it's no more about the land now. If it was about the land, then why is there efforts in every city across the face of the planet to rid those places of Jews as well? It's not about the land at all. No. It's about something far deeper. And
it's confirmation, I think, that we are really, the times we're headed towards. Well, we're not going to be date setting and time setting or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But this rise in anti-Semitism has really peaked at the moment. And when you're describing what took place at the original Hanukkah, there's strong similarities, even the barbarism that we have seen of late and what took place there. They're not, you wouldn't normally think of separating that more than 2,000 years, because you think, well, we're meant to be more sophisticated, we're meant to be more educated, we're meant to have moved on. But in many respects, when it comes to the Jews, no, we haven't moved on. When it comes to the land, when it comes to the apple of God's eye, we haven't moved on at all. But what is great is they did get the victory. The oil lasted 8 days, and this is massive cause for celebration that Jesus took part in. But we're looking at, the whole aspect of anti-Semitism here, Tom, and with Hanukkah, it's, like you said earlier, two types, assimilation and annihilation, and Hanukkah is very much the assimilation. That brings us on to something that, maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're less familiar with. We think, but surely assimilation in many respects, not when it comes to paganism and all the rest of it, but within the world of Christianity and this one new man. You're smiling already, you know where I'm going with this. The one new man theology on the surface. I mean, we're talking about something that's mentioned in Ephesians chapter 2, I think. Tell us a little bit about that.
You had to go there, didn't you?
I had to go here.
To go there. Well, it's interesting. So I think within the Christian world, generally speaking, and I want to paint broad brush strokes, there's been an understanding for about the last 2,000 years that when a Jew comes to understand that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah, that they shed all of their Jewish identity, all of the practices associated with it, and they become Christian. And in the minds of most people, becoming Christian looks very different from being Jewish, doesn't it? And yet it didn't for Yeshua. It didn't for the disciples. It didn't for Paul. They remained faithful Jews all throughout their lifestyle. But some of Paul's words in Ephesians, in relation to one new man, I believe have been misunderstood. There is still distinction between man and woman, slave and free, Jew and Gentile, literally speaking, practically, physically speaking. But for the purposes of being justified before God, being saved in other terms, then there is no preference. And one of the problems that Paul faced time and time again, and he talks about it in Galatians, in Romans, Ephesians, and Paul's talking to Gentile audiences, is that there was this misunderstanding that Gentiles needed to convert, get circumcised, proselytize and become Jews in order to be accepted by God.
But that's not the case, and we saw that in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, and really what they kind of like nailed down there were, what were the essentials in terms of what happens when, a Gentile becomes a believer. So the one new man that you're talking about really is something entirely different to where a lot of people have tried to take it.
Well, whilst in the first century there was this sort of understanding that Gentiles should lose their Gentile identity and become Jewish, which Paul recognised wasn't correct. Peter had to have a dream in order to correct his understanding on it. Christian mentality has done the exact opposite, and what it's trying to do is cause Jews to lose their Jewish identity and become Christian. And actually, that's a form of assimilation. We lose Jewish identity.
And that, well, I mean, what Paul is really saying here is, you know, not, I mean, we've still got male and female. You know, he's basically saying here about, you know, there not being Greek and Jew, the circumcised, etc. We're all one in Christ. We all come to salvation and saving faith the one way, through the blood of Yeshua. Absolutely. There is no other way. So in that respect, but you don't lose your identity. You know, we don't suddenly become genderless because we are believers now. That's not the case. That might be the case in terms of a lot of what we're hearing at the moment, but not the case at all. The one new man, the common denominator, is the blood of Yeshua. That's what it is.
It certainly is. And
I can't believe where the time's gone. Just wrapping up with Hanukkah, we've got our Hanukkahs. We can remember how God actually saw the Jews into freedom, into liberation, way back then in terms of that Maccabean revolt. And the Hanukkah, you've got your 8 branches and then the, what do we call it again? The Shamash in the center. And that's how many of us will choose to celebrate Hanukkah. And also foods, lots of lovely oily foods. Donuts.
Donuts, fish and chips if you want to go down there. Yeah, absolutely. Just one other thing, if I might add it in, is that this was the moment in John 10:22 when Yeshua's standing in the temple, celebrating, along with the rest of the Jewish community, the victory of the Maccabees over Antiochus Epiphanes, the man who said, "I am God." And this is the moment Yeshua said, he wasn't God. I and the Father are one. I am God in the flesh. And this was what provoked. He could have said that at any time. He could have said it at any time, but he chose in the shadow of the temple and the celebration of Hanukkah to declare that to his Jewish brothers and sisters. And
there's a lot as well pointing towards the Antichrist with Antiochus Epiphanes as well. There's there's a lot that we can look at, or we could have looked at, but sadly we don't have time for. And I can just honestly, Tom, thank you so much. I think it's more important than even the last time we all caught up together to be talking about these things and to be remembering that all of this onslaught against the Jews, there will be one winner and one winner only, and that is God Almighty.
Amen.
Absolutely, and we need to hang on to that. We need to stand with Israel. We need to support them. This isn't a new scenario, this anti-Semitism. It's been going on for centuries. But we thank you for your company. Join us again very soon and journey through the feasts.